Hey everyone, thanks for checking out this in-depth breakdown of some of the most popular camera log formats. We're going to be taking a look at almost every kind of major log format that you might find yourself shooting with and comparing them all to the Arri Alexa 35, which is really the gold standard for cinema, color science, and color quality. So throughout this entire breakdown, we're going to be looking at not only the Alexa 35, of course, but also footage shot on Blackmagic, Canon, DJI, Fuji, GoPro, iPhone, Lumix, Nikon, Red, and of course, Sony S-Log3. So let's start here by taking a look at this full screen image captured on the Alexa 35 in Log C4. I'll just turn off the conversion LUT. All that's been added here is this Rec. 709 conversion. So when I toggle that on, you could see even without any additional color, the Log C4 profile on that camera and that sensor just works so beautifully. You could almost use this as a final image if you didn't want to stylize it too much. It just has very natural color tones, perfect amount of saturation, skin tones look great, the shadow and highlight levels are perfect. It's retaining all the detail and the light at the top of the frame as you would imagine on the Alexa. And overall, this is just such a great baseline for us to start from. As you'll see as we go through the other shots here, none of them are going to look quite this good straight off of the cards with just a Rec. 709 conversion. However, a lot of them are closer than you might expect, and it's not always the cameras that you would think are going to deliver. So I'm excited to kind of break this down and see if you guys are as surprised as I was about some of these results. And I should also mention all of this was shot in a controlled studio environment. Whenever possible, we aim to use the same lenses, the same aperture settings, same lighting. But in some instances, like with the DJI footage or the GoPro footage, we're using the built-in lenses. So there are some variables that we have to take into account as we go through. But that's also true of real-world shooting. So for anyone out there in the real world, this is about as close to a scientific test as we can get, at least given our resources for this production. And hopefully it gives you a really strong starting point for better understanding your camera and your format and what you're working with as a filmmaker and as a colorist, so you can match different cameras together and get better results that look more Alexa-like if that's your goal. So let's start here with our first footage. So this was captured on a Blackmagic 4.6K Ursa Mini, and this is using the Gen 5 color science. We'll go full screen here, and I will just toggle on the Rec. 709 LUT. And right off the bat, that's looking really solid. Anyone that's shot on Blackmagic before knows that this is a really great camera. It has really solid color science. Most of the new Blackmagics are just able to deliver really beautiful colors with that Gen 5 color science. There are some differences though, if we want to pull up the Alexa 35 here, just kind of split screen them. These are very different images. The Alexa feels more neutral. There's a little more color separation, whereas the Blackmagic is sort of pushing a lot more warmth into the skin tones, almost in a way that is reminiscent of sort of older Canon footage that I was familiar shooting with years back. And there are, some other differences in terms of levels. The black levels are coming in a little bit deeper and richer on the Alexa 35. The Blackmagic is kind of sitting a little bit higher in terms of those shadow details and shadow level. But overall, it's a really good starting point. And knowing what I know about grading Blackmagic footage, I would have no worry at all about taking this shot and matching it to the Alexa and getting it where it needs to be to just look that much more dialed in. So we'll leave the Blackmagic footage there for now, but I will say I'm going to give it a pretty solid review right off the bat. I think we're getting really nice colors and a really good neutral starting point, even if it's not quite as perfect as what we're getting with the Alexa 35. So next we're going to take a look at some footage shot on Canon, and we're actually going to look at two different shots. So this one was shot with Canon C-Log, standard C-Log, and then next we're going to look at C-Log3. These are both on the EOS R5. And so let's take a look at C-Log first. We'll go into full screen. I'm going to add the Rec. 709 conversion LUT. And this is not terrible as a starting place, but it's definitely a little bit further away from Alexa than the Blackmagic footage was. This is feeling like it's skewing more magenta, there's less saturation, it's a little more lifeless overall, and it feels like it's not really holding a ton of mid-tone contrast, even though the highlights are clipping and the shadows are pretty deep. So overall, not a terrible starting point, but let's compare it to the Alexa 35 just to see how different it is. You could feel, how much more color separation and life overall this image has in it comparatively. Just looking at the green here in the Canon footage, it's pretty drab. Compare and contrast that to the Alexa, and the Alexa is just really great at bringing up saturation levels where you need them without oversaturating the image. It just sort of feels like cheating, like it's doing kind of a lot of the heavy lifting for you in camera, which is one of the reasons I love working with it. And of course, Canon footage is more than capable of looking absolutely beautiful in post. Some of my favorite shots that I've captured over the year were on Canons. But again, we're looking at this from the point of view of what is your starting point going to be. So let's now compare that with this shot. This was, again, also captured on the same camera, but this is using Canon C-Log3. And this also skews a little bit more magenta, but this is looking a lot better in my opinion. If we just toggle these back and forth, this is magenta. It's a little bit oversaturated, but it feels like the contrast ratios and the overall levels are at least sitting in a more natural and more dynamic place. So if I had to choose one as a starting point, I would definitely choose the C-Log3, even though neither of these are going to be a direct match for the Alexa 35. The C-Log3 is close enough that it's going to save us some time and probably a couple of extra steps grading to try to match that look. The next footage we're going to look at here was captured on DJI in D-Log, and this was one of the most surprising results from the test. I will mention right off the bat before I apply the Rec. 709 LUT, due to some time constraints and technical barriers sort of on the day, we only had time to capture at 5600 white balance setting as opposed to some of the other shots. Actually, all of the other shots that we're looking at were captured at 32. So what that means in this context, you're going to not see the same kind of blue daylight spilling in through the background. But even with that in mind, knowing that this particular shot was a little bit less controlled than the others, let's put this Rec. 709 conversion on, and this is looking really good to my eye. This feels like a very natural and neutral starting point with organic skin tones, plenty of color separation, good contrast levels. It will feel different, of course, from the Alexa, not only because it is shot at 5600, but also just because there are differences in our contrast levels and our black levels and saturation and all sorts of other things. But what I will say is that I was personally very impressed by the DJI and what it was giving me as a starting point. I hadn't shot a lot in D-Log personally before, so I didn't really know what to expect. And especially after grading this image, we're going to go through later and kind of take a look at what these different shots need to kind of bring out some of their best qualities. But I was really impressed by DJI, and that was kind of one of the big surprises that landed with me as I went through this whole process. So the next camera we're going to look at here is actually my Fuji X-T4. This is my personal camera. I've used this on so many shoots, and this was shot with Fuji F-Log. So for any Fuji shooters out there, you won't be surprised to see that when we turn on the Rec. 709 conversion, we get some really, really nice colors here. The overall levels, again, are looking fantastic. It's preserving a lot of that highlight detail. The shadow levels are nice and strong and deep without feeling too crushed. It is skewing a little bit more magenta, I would say, in terms of skin tones than the Alexa. And it's definitely going to have a different feel as we, once again, wipe the Alexa 35 footage across. But overall, when you kind of just look at the images, A and B, these feel like they match pretty nicely without a whole lot of manual adjustments. If we were to add a little bit more color separation by pushing some cooler tones into the shadows here and just getting some of the levels for the skin tones up to match these Alexa 35 levels a little bit more closely, we'd be able to get this Fuji footage matching Alexa quite quickly. So I'll give Fuji credit here on what they're able to deliver with F-Log, even on this older Fuji X-T4 that we shot with. it's just really impressive what Fuji has been able to do in terms of color science. And it's not surprising considering their background in manufacturing and creating analog film stock. So for any other Fuji shooters out there, you're probably not shocked by this result, but hopefully this helps others understand why so many of us that are working with Fuji are drawn to it specifically based on the colors that it's able to generate. And it also grades really well, which makes it that much easier to match it to something like the Alexa 35. Next, I'm going to show you some footage from a GoPro, and unfortunately, I will say I was quite disappointed in the results here. So I'm a big GoPro fan. Some of my first cameras were GoPros back in the day, and I really love shooting on that format. I have a soft spot for it, but this GP-Log footage, when we add the Rec 709 conversion, is just skewing very magenta. There's always so much internal processing going on in the GoPro. You obviously can have some control over that, but overall, it's just not looking great. Even if we were to skew the tint axis here to eliminate some of those cooler, bluer, more magenta tones, and we can try to test that in a little bit, we're going to see it's going to take a lot more work to match it to that Alexa 35 baseline. So let's do a quick split screen here. And these are like night and day in every way, not only the color balance, but the way that the levels are sitting, how bright the image feels overall in the upper mids and the highlights. Even though there's actually quite a bit of depth in the shadows, it just feels like the contrast is sort of all over the place. The color balance isn't quite working. And it's just, overall, really the roughest image here that we've looked at so far as our starting point is concerned. So next I'm going to show you some footage that I was actually most impressed with. Of anything here, this was shot on an Apple iPhone in Apple Log, and I'm going to turn on the Rec 709 conversion. And if you just look at how great that image looks right off the bat, this feels very natural. It actually, to me, feels the most like the Blackmagic footage if we were just to toggle these back and forth. So here's Blackmagic. Here's iPhone. These are pretty similar in a lot of ways. They have a lot of nice organic looking color balance, but they do skew a little bit warm, which isn't bad. But again, if you're trying to match Alexa 35, that is going to feel like you're gonna need to pull that back a little bit. You're gonna have to dial in some magenta, a little bit of cool shadow detail to kind of get that to match. We're also going to keep an eye on some of these black levels. Again, I think because of some of the internal processing on iPhones, occasionally it gives you a little bit of that HDR look. So you do want to be cognizant of that and add additional contrast or pull down your black levels whenever you can to try to get it to better match. But again, overall, just as a starting point, considering this was a phone, much like the DJI, which I wasn't expecting amazing results out of, the iPhone really kind of blew me away in this regard. It feels like it has probably the best color science of any of the log formats here that we've gone through other than the Alexa 35. So let's keep moving here. But again, really impressed with the Apple iPhone. And I think their technology and their color science is only likely to get better and better as we go. So next, we're going to be taking a look at two shots here that were captured on a Lumix GH7. And the reason there's two is because the GH7 lets you shoot in either standard V-Log or using the Arri LogC3 color science. And they're going to give slightly different results. Forgive the framing here. We can't see the bright light in the background, but we have tested this on other Lumix shots. So I'm able to at least speak with some experience to kind of some of the differences that we're going to notice here. So let's take a look at this in full screen. Again, this is standard V-Log. Not the LogC3, just standard Lumix V-Log. And when we add that Rec 709 conversion, this is looking pretty good as a starting point. It's definitely skewing, again, a little bit more magenta. The Alexa tends to handle skin tones that much better than almost every camera. It has that perfect balance of feeling neutral with just a touch of warmth. not too much magenta, which with certain skin tones can skew like really purple or just look too warm or kind of unnatural. So this is skewing a little bit magenta, and you know, that can be mitigated obviously with a couple of secondary corrections. But overall, it's a pretty solid starting point. And if we compare it to the Alexa 35, it's not exactly a match for Alexa 35, particularly in terms of the color balance in the midtones. But I do think that in other ways it matches fairly well. It feels like the richness and the depth of the image is pretty similar. Her skin tones are definitely popping more here than they are in the Lumix footage. And of course, there's plenty of differences when we go back. These do not by any means match, but sometimes there's just a certain feeling that an image gives you in terms of the weight and the density and the way that the colors all kind of blend together. And I think there are some similarities on kind of a fundamental level in terms of how V-Log represents colors and reproduces colors and what I might see with the Alexa 35. Now let's take a look at this shot. This is captured in log C3 on the Lumix GH7. We'll toggle on the Rec 709 conversion, and this is giving us a very different look. It's still skewing a bit in that magenta territory, but the levels are a lot higher. It's kind of pushing all of the exposure into the upper mids and into that highlight range. So we're getting kind of a brighter starting point, which is actually pretty good for grading. It looks a little bit less finished right off the bat, but sometimes it's easier to drop your shadows down and maintain the integrity of skin tones and other mid-tone details, opposed to fighting it by going the other way and pushing the exposure up. So I actually like this a lot as a starting point. And again, we'll compare it to Alexa. Very different image here. This still feels like it needs a lot of color. In fact, it feels like it needs more color than the standard V-Log does, because there's just more density in this image right off the bat. But as we'll see in a little bit, when we color match these to the Alexa 35, the LogC3 is going to get there quicker and more easily. So if I had to pick, and for any Lumix shooters out there, if you have the ability to shoot on LogC3, I would go with that. It's just going to make your life a little bit easier in post, and it's going to get you that much closer to that Alexa look if that's what you're going for. Next is footage from a camera that personally I'd never shot on before this test shoot. This is a Nikon Z6, and we used an external recorder to capture Nikon N-Log, which I've never used. It's a fairly rare format, but I wanted to make sure it was represented here because there are some Nikon shooters out there that are using it. So when we toggle on the Rec 709 conversion, we can see that this is a very different image from anything that we've seen so far. The Nikon N-Log is kind of in its own category, not in terms of it necessarily being better or worse, but it just feels like it handles color in a very different way than a lot of the other formats that we've looked at so far. So overall, the exposure is definitely much higher. Again, it's kind of pushing the highlights and the midtones up. It's skewing a lot cooler in certain areas, particularly in the shadows, than some of the other formats that we looked at. And it's not particularly saturated in those mids or highlight areas. If you look at, for example, the camera on the right, which is falling into kind of darker mid shadow area, the blue and the red on that camera is actually popping fairly well, but on the color chart, which is more evenly exposed and more properly exposed, we're losing a lot of that color depth. So the Nikon footage can definitely be worked with, but it just feels like the saturation feels very uneven. Take a look at the bottom left of the screen, how the red is just jumping out of that camera bag, but the red on the color chart is not. So I would say that Nikon N-Log is definitely a solid format to work with, but it's going to take a bit of a learning curve because it feels very different from some of the other formats that you're probably more accustomed to. And again, looking at our Alexa footage here as a baseline, just totally different. It's going to take quite a bit of work to get that to match, but what I will say is you can get it there. You can get it pretty close, and we're going to look at exactly how close we can get in just a moment. So next we're going to be looking at some red footage, and the tricky thing with red in this scenario is that there's so many different red cameras and their sensors vary quite a bit in terms of what you can expect from them. So for the purpose of this test, we're using a red Komodo because it's one of the most common red cameras now due to the price point. And hopefully that gives you a rough idea, but you're going to get slightly different results if you're shooting on a different sensor or a different red model. They're all kind of have their own nuances. So let's turn on the Rec 709 conversion here. And this is looking pretty good, I think, as a starting point. It's not quite as natural as the Alexa footage in some ways, and that's probably a little bit to be expected. It definitely is a richer image right off the card. It has more density in the midtones. It has a little bit more saturation. The skin tones are skewing warmer, and the shadows are also skewing just a touch warmer as well. But it's a good starting point, and that's really what we should expect at this point from Red. They've put out so many cameras over the years. They've developed their own color science, so I'm not surprised to see that we're getting pretty decent results here. But again, just very different. This feels like a totally different image in many ways. We're seeing just the way that the face and the skin tones just kind of land in that very natural, very kind of neutral territory. We're going to have to do some more work here on the red footage to get it to match this look if that's what we're going for. But overall, not a bad starting point at all. So let's take a look here at our very final shot. And this is an important one. This is shot on Sony S-Log3. So this is probably the most common S-Log format out there, I would imagine. Almost everyone I know is shooting on some version of Sony S-Log3. It's very popular for good reason. But one of the challenges, as we'll see here, is right off the bat, when we add the Rec 709 conversion, it doesn't look great. The format has so much capability. There's so much under the hood with S-Log that you can really get your colors to look amazing, I think, with it, with enough time in the grade. But just adding the Rec 709 conversion is not enough. This version of it looks pretty drab, pretty lifeless. If you look at her hair and the way that it's just kind of clipping to white with this Rec 709 conversion, obviously we'd have to bring back some of that detail. We'd have to reintroduce some colors, bring up the saturation. And let's just take a look at that compared to the Alexa 35. So here, again, it just feels like a full spectrum of colors that we're seeing, and the Sony footage feels like we're missing something. It just feels like there's an element to it, and really there's a couple elements to it that are kind of lacking. But I think it's really worth stating, and this took me a long time to learn, because for a long time I would see results like this with Sony and just kind of write off S-Log3, but the color science itself does retain a huge amount of data, and it is more than capable of, as we've seen on movies like The Creator and other films that have shot S-Log3 and broadcast and done theatrical releases to millions of people. It's an amazing format in a lot of ways. You just, similar to Red, but in a different way, you just kind of have to know what you're dealing with in post so you can really maximize the color science. It's not going to look the best right off the bat, but with the right approach in post, you can really unlock the potential of S-Log3 and bring it to new heights. So before we move on, let's just kind of recap here. So we've gone through 13 different shots, and surprisingly, the two that are the closest right off the cards, with the exception of possibly Blackmagic, would be the DJI and the Apple iPhone, which I was not expecting. But in a way, it's actually not the most surprising thing, because if you think about, just take Apple, for example, they are so limited by what they can do with their smaller sensor sizes and just the limitations of having a camera on board with a phone, not having a bigger sensor, not having the additional hardware that they might need with a mirrorless camera, or that a DSLR or a cinema camera is going to have. So they've really had to work that much harder to make sure the color science is dialed in, and what they're doing internally with the software is extracting the best and most natural colors and giving us the best results with their log format. So in a way, I think the limitation, and this is me speculating here, but my belief is that the limitations that Apple has faced, that DJI has faced in terms of extracting a maximum amount of quality from a smaller sensor, is actually an asset to them, because it's allowed them to deliver just some of the most beautiful results in terms of their log to Rec 709 conversion. Unfortunately, I couldn't say the same thing about GoPro, so they're sort of the counterpoint to that argument. But again, for anyone looking to shoot something on either of those cameras, and particularly those of you that have iPhones and you want to just go out and shoot something, hopefully this is a good reminder that that should not stop you, that you should not be worried about shooting something on your iPhone, at least from a color perspective. You're going to be able to get some really, really beautiful results. So before we move on and I show you some footage that's been matched, color matched specifically to the Alexa 35, I want to show you just a couple of the adjustments you might want to make on shots like these. So we're not going to go through and match each of these perfectly. I may actually create separate individual videos if you guys are interested in seeing that, and we can kind of look at how to get each of these individual cameras to match the Alexa. But again, if we're just taking a real quick look here, Alexa 35 versus Blackmagic, one of the first things that we could do is drop our levels down, drop our shadows down. And that's already looking a lot closer. We're going to cool the image down a little bit. And you could see that right off the bat, without doing too much, we're able to get this Blackmagic footage to somewhat match the Alexa. And of course, we can, dial it in further, adjust the tint, and, create secondaries and make sure, these walls are matching perfectly. We're not going to have the time for that in this video. But again, I want to just illustrate how easy or difficult it may be to match any of these individual shots. Next, we'll take a look at the Canon C-Log footage. This one's going to be a little bit trickier because we're dealing with these highlight issues up here. So I might actually come into the curve adjustment and just sort of pull up the levels like this and bring some of the shadows back down without crushing it too much. We're going to get rid of some of that magenta, maybe increase the saturation a little bit. And I could tell right off the bat, this one's going to be a little bit trickier to match than our Blackmagic footage. The nature of the cameras and the just organic feel of the footage is that much more different than what we were seeing with the Blackmagic footage. So of course we can eventually get it closer, but it's going to take a lot more dialing in. And I would say that, the same is going to be true here of the Canon C-Log3. So next we'll take a look at the DJI. This one we're not going to try to match perfectly because, again, this was the one that was done at 5600 Kelvin as a color balance setting. What I will do is just drop down the shadows here and kind of bring the mids down, maybe just stretch out the contrast a little bit, boost the saturation slightly, cool it down, just kind of bring us into kind of a more neutral territory, just so we could see how good this image can really look. Again, DJI before and after, that's a pretty strong, pretty neutral starting place. And it's not going to be a perfect match quite yet, but it's not that far off considering this was shot at 5600 and Alexa was shot at 3200. So again, lots of points go to DJI on this one. Next here, we can take a look at our Fuji footage. And as I said before, I know just looking at this footage and having worked with a lot of Fuji material, that this is very gradable. We're holding a lot of detail here in the highlights, so I can actually push them up a tiny bit more, pushing up my mids. I'm just gonna, again, do the most basic adjustments here just to kind of get us in the right ballpark. And we'll bring up that Alexa 35 reference. This is feeling a little touch greener, so we'll push some magenta overall. And we're getting closer, but again, we're gonna have to take a little bit of time to really get her shirt to match, her skin tone. Not a bad starting point at all, but again, gonna take some work here with Fuji. It kind of has its own look that's built in. Here's the real problem area when we get into footage like this on the GoPro. This is going to take a lot more finessing, a lot more secondaries. So I'll start by just kind of bringing this contrast curve here down a little bit. And I'll try to roll off the highlights just because they're feeling, quite harsh. We got to get rid of the magenta. So I'll push some green in here just to kind of neutralize the white balance. We can cool it down a little bit. And we're going to get this looking closer, but again, it's, certain things are kind of baked into the footage. The nature of this footage just feels more intense. It feels like the contrast is more intense, and we can reduce that in our own way, but there's just elements of it that are still going to linger and still going to be present no matter what we do. So for the purpose of this demo, that's about as far as I'm going to take this particular shot. You could see that, we're getting closer, but we still have a lot of work to do if we want to get that to be a perfect match. Next, let's take a look at this iPhone footage, which again, I've been very impressed with. The biggest thing here I'm noticing, and I always start, by the way, when I'm grading, just with whatever the most obvious problem is, and then that will typically reveal the next problem, and you can kind of solve things sequentially from there. So let's drop these shadow levels down so they're a better match. Now let's kind of cool down. I'm actually going to use the gamma wheel here just to kind of cool the skin tones down a little bit. And I'm also going to push the highlights up so we're getting to a closer range. And if you look at that, like with just a couple of steps, these aren't perfect. I still need to warm up the shadows a little bit. Again, I don't want to take too much time on any individual shot, but like, look how close we're able to get those two with, just a couple of very quick tweaks. So, big, congrats to whoever is doing the color science at Apple. I have to give them credit for pulling this off here. Now let's take a look at our Lumix V-Log footage. So as we saw before, it's definitely skewing a lot more magenta. So we're going to push some green in there. We're going to sort of brighten it up, just bring the highlights up, brings the mids up a little bit more. Try to just get this into more of a neutral territory, crush the shadows back down, probably push a touch more warmth in, add some saturation. And this is looking pretty good, again, without dialing it in too much further. These are much closer. We're still feeling some of that magenta, so I'll pull out a little bit more, but not bad at all. I'm pretty impressed by it. I think that the main thing you'd probably have to work with here on the Vlog footage is just some of the saturation and just being really careful about selectively saturating your image to kind of match what we're seeing here on the Alexa 35, but not at all a bad baseline. And as I said before, I kind of like the way that this version that's shot in LogC3 is kind of pushing the overall levels a little bit higher, because it's always easier just to take the shadows and just drop them down. And then we're basically leaving our skin tones intact where they were. Next step here, we can pull some of this magenta out. This one's skewing very magenta. Add some saturation in just to kind of see what we're working with. And we're starting to get closer, so this needs a little bit more work to dial in, but it does feel like it has more color separation overall compared to the standard log footage. So by no means a perfect grade here, but again, I'm going to say that I could probably get the LogC3 footage matching the LogC4 from the actual Alexa 35 more quickly than I would with just the standard Vlog. Next, let's take a look at N-Log, which is our most different of all of them. So let's go ahead and grab our color curve here, and we're just going to pull that down to kind of make the exposure look a little bit more natural. And I actually really like the way that the Nikon N-Log handles these adjustments to the exposure. It seems to be fairly responsive, and it's looking really nice overall. As we brought that down, obviously we're reintroducing more saturation here, which was a big problem we had before with this footage. So it's a little too saturated. I'm going to pull some of that out. Let's bring up the Alexa 35. Again, fundamentally a very different image here. So the Nikon, I'm going to say, is going to take some of the most work to match the Alexa 35, but I will add the caveat that it also looks pretty good in its own way off the card. So it's just kind of a different look. We can get it somewhat in the right ballpark here now, but we're only going to be able to take it so far without some additional tweaking and secondary corrections. But, overall, this is not a bad look. And if we look at original, we could just take it back to, what it looks like strictly with the Rec 709 conversion. We've taken it quite far and definitely brought it closer to that Alexa 35 territory. Here, let's take a look at the red. So the red is really just going to need to boost some of those mid-tone levels. So I'm just going to make the simplest possible correction there for that. We're looking at the skin tones, which are much warmer here. So I'm going to cool these down. I'm going to skew it just a touch more magenta. But we could see that that's actually throwing off the color balance here in the highlights, which Need to now skew a little bit warmer again. So this is going to be a bit of a push-pull with shadows, mids, and highlights. Similar to the Nikon footage, I'm going to say the red footage really does have its own look built in. And of course, you know, we can get this much closer than it currently is to the Alexa, but we're just kind of fighting against the color science a little bit more than we are with some of the other profiles, particularly as we've seen Blackmagic, Apple Log, and DJI. And now let's look at the Sony S-Log3. So this one's really important, again, because so many of you are shooting on this. Right off the bat, you know, we're seeing lots of issues with highlights, lots of issues with overall saturation levels. So let's try to restore some of those highlights. Instead of boosting up the highlights to crazy levels like the LUT tends to do, we're just going to boost the mids and kind of pull the highlights back down. So we're going to get the levels just feeling more natural, but still trying to capture that nice, deep, kind of rich shadow tone. So I'm going to land roughly around here just to my eye. Let's pull up the Alexa. That's looking closer. We're going to increase, I'm going to do color boost here instead of saturation just to bring some more color and life into the right areas. So we're getting closer there, still feeling a little magenta. I'm going to push a little bit of green in here, cool it down a touch, maybe add some regular saturation, and we're starting to get closer. We're still not quite there. We're going to need to use the color wheels on this to really kind of play around with the shadows, mids, and highlights and get exactly the color balance that we need. But we're not so far off. Like I could see that this S-Log3 image would be fully capable of landing at least somewhere in that Alexa 35 territory. Even though it's not quite there yet, it's certainly better than, let's revert back to the original here. This is just with the Rec 709 LUT applied. We're getting it into kind of a more organic, more kind of filmic territory. So hopefully so far that gives you guys a good overview of just kind of the limitations or the benefits of some of these different profiles. But I now want to show you, before we wrap this up, a couple of quick before and after examples of some of this footage graded with our Cinespace Alexa 35 matched LUTs. So I'm going to go over here to the LUT tab. This is our Cinespace collection. So every camera that you saw here today, we've made a minimum of 4 LUTs for that are specifically designed to match the Arri Alexa 35 color science. And each of them have 2 different main variations, one for 3200 white balance, one for 5600 white balance. And then there's an A and B version for each, which give you slightly different color palettes and may help, especially if you're working under mixed lighting conditions. I'll also just step here into Canon for a second to show you we have versions for C-Log, C-Log2, and C-Log3. And in Lumix, we have versions for LogC3 and V-Log. So your bases are going to be covered almost no matter what. And I'm going to show you just the difference in the impact that some of these LUTs have. So I'm going to show you right off the bat our Blackmagic footage here. So this only has a single Cinespace LUT applied to it. I'll toggle that on and off. And with just that one correction, we're getting that much closer to the Alexa 35 look. I'm actually going to grab a still of this so I can compare it and contrast it with the original Blackmagic footage, which we have here. And let's take a look and just note how warm this footage is in comparison. And if we wipe this across, how much more Alexa-like we're getting just with that one single LUT that's been very meticulously crafted to emulate the color science as closely as possible without degrading the quality of the final image. So I'll delete that still. I'm going to step back here. I'll show you maybe 1 or 2 other examples quickly. Let's go to S-Log3 because that's probably our most common format here. And again, I'll take one screenshot from our S-Log3 footage. This is just with the Cinespace S-Log conversion applied. Here we're looking at before and after. And let's compare that to the native S-Log3 footage. It's really night and day if we pull these up and just swipe across. These are like completely different images. And now take a look once more at our Cinespace LUT, and I'll click straight from there over to the Alexa 35. And these are a very close match. Again, just with a single LUT, no secondary corrections. and we're already really close. Finally, let's take a look at iPhone here, because this is another super common format that's only becoming more popular as the days go on. And I'll grab a screenshot of this so we can pull it up and contrast it against our native iPhone footage. And let's pull that up, swipe across, and you can see we're really bringing in a lot of that Alexa color balance, those cooler shadows, those preserved skin tones, and just the overall feel that we expect from the Alexa, which is right here. So we're really able to match all of these cameras very quickly and easily using the Cinespace collection. And one of the biggest benefits of this tool, especially if you're using more than one camera on a production or in an edit, is that you can use Cinespace LUTs as a universal baseline or an intermediate step to match all of your footage. So let's say you have a scene or a sequence that was shot in S-Log3, C-Log, on Red, and on Blackmagic Gen 5 color science. You can apply one of these LUTs to each camera, and they're immediately going to snap into place, and the colors are going to be much closer to a match right off the bat without any secondary corrections, all while emulating the look and feel of the Alexa 35 color science. So hopefully you guys will check out those Cinespace LUTs if you're interested. Otherwise, I also hope you just enjoyed this demo in general, and it gives you a little bit more clarity about how to work with some of these different formats, what some of the pros and cons are, and what you might need to expect as far as post-production time is concerned. If you enjoyed this demo, please like and subscribe here on YouTube. We're going to be putting out tons more videos like this in the future, so stay tuned for that, and we'll see you next time.